In my capacity as Chair of the Assembly and Executive Review Committee, I am delighted to welcome you all to today's seminar. The theme of this session is the impact of Scottish Independence Referendum on devolution and governance in the United Kingdom. The referendum on Scottish independence was a highly significant constitutional event, and its impact will continue to be felt in the coming years. Although the majority of voters opted to keep Scotland in the Union, it is clear that the debate on the future shape of devolution in the United Kingdom is just beginning. This can be immediately seen in the recent publication of the command paper setting out proposals from the main Westminster parties for devolving more power to the Scottish Parliament. But the debate extends beyond Scotland to England, to Wales, and of course here to Northern Ireland. In particular, it will be interesting to see how we will be impacted by changes to the current devolution settlements. The Assembly and Executive Review Committee will likely have a key role in the future decisions around the nature of devolution and its consequences for the Northern Ireland Assembly. With that in mind, it is with great pleasure that I introduced the speakers to you today. Dr. Gerry Mooney and Dr. Philip O'Sullivan are from the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Open University. They are going to offer reflections on the referendum and its potential impact on the future of devolution in the UK. Unfortunately, committee business prohibits me from staying any longer, but I wish you all well this afternoon in your deliberations. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon everyone. I'm Gerry Mooney from the Open University in Scotland. My colleague Philip O'Sullivan, both in the Social Sciences faculty. Philip is based here in Belfast, and we're really delighted to be here today with our friends and partners as part of the KES series. So thanks to everyone for their invitation and for allowing the Open University to play a part in this, I think, really important series of seminars. There's an obvious division of labour between us. I've flown in from Scotland this morning, so as you might imagine, I'm going to focus on issues about the Scottish Independence Referendum and what has happened as a result of that referendum and its consequences, not only for the UK as a whole, but specifically for here in Northern Ireland, although there may be issues that are even beyond the UK, because as we know, in the last few days there's been an issue about independence in Catalonia. So there's other parts of the world very much looking at the UK and looking at Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland to see what future will hold for them in relation to devolution and possible independence for parts of it. So we're going to go through the slides. I should say that the slides that you've got, or the copy of the slides you have in your pack, are slightly different from the ones we are going to present. It's a rapidly changing scene over in Scotland. Every day something else comes out, and I find I'm having to rewrite the slides almost on a twice daily basis. But I understand that the slides that will go up on the relevant website afterwards will be the ones that we are talking to. It's generally minor changes, but there are some important things we've added in. So I want to just put this into general context. I said I want to focus very much on the Scottish Independence Referendum and some of its outcomes, and Philip, as I said, will pick up on what this means for people here in Northern Ireland. One of the things that has struck me and other commentators in Scotland is that outside Scotland, in many ways there has been a general misunderstanding of some of the issues that drove the Scottish independence campaign. And I want to try and just address that in some ways. And in particular, what we want to do is focus on the relationship between national or nationalist and constitutional issues on the one hand, and what I would generally call social justice and social welfare issues on the other. For example, UK government welfare reform, or cuts, depending on your political viewpoint, were very much part of the debate in Scotland around Scottish independence. And what I would want to suggest to you all, what we both would want to suggest to you all, is that issues of welfare, while they were central to the Scottish independence debate, are also now central in other ways to the future shape of UK society and the future direction of UK society. The Scottish Independence Referendum was widely heralded as settling for once and for all the future constitutional status of Scotland, and in that context also perhaps the rest of the UK. However, that referendum, which on the 19th of September was heralded as having saved the United Kingdom, having saved the Union, may now have contributed to its future dissolution. And in many respects, I would argue that in some ways, a vote for independence would have been the cleaner outcome. It would have been the more certain outcome, irrespective of your views on that. What we have now is quite a lot of uncertainty about the future direction of Scotland, Wales, England, and of course Northern Ireland, the UK as a whole. Now, to the outside world, and I'm just back from a series of lectures in the United States, and to the outside world, people look at the UK as if it's a homogeneous, unified entity. What they fail to often pick up is that the United Kingdom is a multinational union of different countries and different nations. And I think that's important because that's part of the debate today. What kind of country do we live in this place, the United Kingdom? Now, we know the UK is an economic union, it's a social union, in some ways it's a political union, it has been a military union, it's also, again, in some different ways, a cultural union, it's also a welfare union. And by that I mean that welfare, and we're interpreting welfare in a very broad sense here, it's not just about benefits, it's about social policy more generally, education, health, housing and so on. That has played a crucial role in the historical development of the United Kingdom, particularly in the post-1945 period. The Beveridgean Keynesian welfare state was very much about projecting an image of a new modern British society. It's central in the Scottish independence debate. It's been central in the history of Northern Ireland. And it's also been part of the history of the United Kingdom in terms of Scotland joining England to form the United Kingdom Parliament in 1707. As many people will maybe remember, or maybe you weren't there in 1707, but you will maybe know, that education, crime, criminal justice, the law remained under Scottish control even after the United Kingdom was created. And what I would suggest is that that history of welfare playing a part in the development of the UK is also now perhaps playing a part in its possible fragmentation. So I'm not saying there is definite fragmentation, there's the possibility of a breaking up or a fragmentation of the UK. And what Philip and I want to emphasise is the role of welfare in that process. Here's a quote we pulled out of The Economist. Some people might have seen this already, September 27th this year. And it just really neatly summarises where things are at the moment in terms of the UK constitutional context. Nobody asked to design a political system for Britain would ever propose the one it has. The one in the large islands and many smaller ones that The Economist calls home are a hodgepodge of parliamentary systems, unevenly distributed powers and constitutional uncertainties. The setup is as uneven as Britain's history is eventful, which is no coincidence. The causes of the mess date back centuries. The latest upheaval, Scotland's referendum on independence, which ended with a no vote on September the 18th, has made things untidier still. Yeah? Now that reinforces the point I've made at the outset, that in many ways the Scottish Independence Referendum outcome has settled absolutely nothing. What it has settled is that it will be more unsettling. Yeah? It has settled there will be more uncertainty. That's what has come out of the Scottish Independence Referendum. So the debate about the future, not only of Scotland, but of the UK and the constitutional arrangements within the UK has really been reignited as a result of that referendum. Now, I just want to briefly just pick out a few things about the referendum campaign and the whole debate around the case for Scottish independence, because many people outside Scotland I've heard this in America, I've heard it from colleagues at the Open University in England, perhaps this is a view that some people in Ireland, North and South may have, is that it was a campaign for Scottish national identity. It was all about asserting a national identity. It was about Scottish home rule. It was about some kind of mythical Braveheart notion of Scottishness. And I would say that that entirely misunderstands what was driving the case for Scottish independence. Now, the way we want to put this is that there is an entanglement. There is a relationship, an uneasy relationship between social welfare and the pursuit of social justice on the one hand, and issues of nationalism and national identity on the other. But in the Scottish independence campaign, the main pro-independence parties were not arguing around any issues about Scottish national identity. What they were arguing around were what we would broadly call social justice, social welfare issues. Opposition to any privatisation of the National Health Service, more public expenditure on housing, health, education, and so on. Strong opposition to any kind of privatisation in schools and so on. And you look back over the independence campaign for the last 2 years, you don't have to look far to find evidence that this was central, not only to the case made for independence, but latterly when Gordon Brown got involved in the defence of the Union, he started to talk about the importance of the welfare union. But up until that point, that had not really been articulated in any clear way at all. So this obviously has opened up huge issues, not only, as I said, for the future of Scotland, but for the future of the entire UK. And what's come out of it, one of the great ironies, at least for many people in Scotland, is that a referendum which was about the independence of Scotland, very quickly, on the early morning of September the 19th, ended up as a discussion about the future of England. And really, for the first time, and certainly in my lifetime, I'm just a boy, as you probably can see, but in my lifetime, England has never really been badged as England. It's part of the UK, but it's not England. Now what has happened is there's been a resurgence of what you could call Englishness, and perhaps even English national identity, albeit that's contested and all the rest of it as we understand it. But for the first time, there's really now on the table demands, uncertain how widespread these are, but demands for some kind of devolution, some kind of parliament for England, or assemblies for the north of England, or what may be the case. So that itself has enormous consequences, not only for England, but has huge consequences for the future of the UK, because if the biggest part of the UK is beginning to see itself more and more as England, and perhaps slightly less and less as Britain or the UK, that has consequences for all of us, not least in this context for us here in Northern Ireland. So I'm going to hand over to Philip, who will pick up on some of these points now and look at how they are beginning to play out in this part of the world. Okay.
Thanks very much, Gerry. In a way, I would say it, Gerry, may be a slightly easier task in that what happened in Scotland is a well-defined debate, and obviously the simple answer to what the implications are going to be for us here in Northern Ireland is that nothing changed immediately. And in a way, that's why we're glad today it's a seminar, it's a series of debates, because there's a number of unknown issues, uncertainties, and I suppose it's really teasing out the possibilities and what the implications of those may be. Obviously, it's very much a question of the counterfactual history. This may well have been a more exciting, I suppose, in one sense, talk if Scotland had voted for independence, because then we'd be looking at all the kind of things we saw in the media at the time, maps of what these islands would look like, what would a revised Union flag be. And obviously the whole debate about Scottish independence here raised issues which touched very closely to people's sense of national identity, their sense of Britishness, their sense of Irishness, Northern Irishness, and those connections. And those obviously are different to what applied in Scotland, because those debates are more raw and more core to sort of political discourse and our daily politics here. So in many senses, speaking about the implications for Northern Ireland, I do so in a qualified way, because what we're going to see really, and as Gerry I think has rightly mentioned, it's what happened in England really, and what will happen in England, certainly coming up to the next general and after the next general election, which is going to shape perhaps the nature of politics and devolution here. I'm also conscious of it's easy to make sort of straight read across from what happened in Scotland, and we have to be cognizant of the fact that what happened in Scotland necessarily won't apply in Northern Ireland, or won't obtain, but I think there are some issues which we can certainly tease out. For example, Nicola Sturgeon said, the debate about Scottish independence is not about identity, but about where political and social powers lie. Could we say the same about devolution politics in Northern Ireland? Arguably, politics here has been, well, for the last nearly 100 years now, and certainly in terms of conflict for the last 40 years, lines on the map and power is really crucial and central here. Less so in Scotland. Scotland, as Gerry has argued, was more about not national identity and a patriotic sort of crude sentimental nationalism, but about self-government. And I think that's the crucial thing here. And the one thing I hold out actually for hope, because it is easy to see Stormont is in deadlock and stalemate, and obviously the crisis we had here of a welfare reform, and to say it's a dysfunctional Stormont and so forth. But devolution is essentially self-government. And I think the thing that is uplifting about what happened in Scotland, although it can be overplayed, is the essence to which the public engaged and took part in politics. So I think what really I would like to take away from what happened in Scotland is Are there any lessons or implications for civic engagement, how people can be revitalised and reconnected to politics here as well? So again, agreeing with Gerry, Cameron's speech on September the 19th, which has now actually been called the Downing Street Constitutional Declaration, to add to our list of other declarations affecting politics here. I wonder in future if he will regret making that speech, or he may wish he did it differently, because he obviously set in train, as the quote at the bottom slide shows, things which actually were in the Conservative Manifesto in 2010, and the Mackay Commission, which was published in 2013, was looking at this issue of English votes for English laws. And certainly as the Conservative Party comes under increased political pressure in England from UKIP, I think the whole thing about evil, English votes for English laws, is going to have a big impact. The question, of course, is what this will mean for Northern Ireland. Now, for people interested in politics and constitutional matters and public policy, this sort of speculation about what might happen if we have, and Gordon Brown raised this as well, I mean, he wanted a renewed home rule, if we have a more federal UK, the options are endless, and there are numberless options for English devolution. There was a talk, and just after actually, almost the day we submitted the papers here, the huge City Growth Commission, which has published, Jim O'Neill, an economist over in England, looking basically for Devo Max for the English regions. I mean, there is 3 basic options for how maybe politics could be devolved in England. We're looking at city regions, areas like Manchester. I mean, Manchester will argue rightly that they have a bigger economy than the whole of Wales, more public spending, and yet Wales can perhaps press Northern Ireland for devolution and powers, and an area like Manchester can't. So this also was reinforced by George Osborne, who gave a speech about the northern powerhouses, you know, things like high-speed rail, infrastructure, trying to devolve power from Westminster. So city assemblies, I mean, John Prescott tried it with the Labour Party in the early 2000s, like 2004, this idea of regional assemblies. They tried it first in the northeast of England because Prescott thought that might have the best chance of some traction there, but it was failed and it was voted down 4-1. But that was sort of over 10 years ago, and things have changed greatly now. So we're not sure what's going to happen, but certainly William Hague was put in charge of a cabinet committee, and he's looking at constitutional change, and top of the agenda is this issue of English MPs really voting only on English laws. So at last, the West Lothian question, which I think Tamdale first raised in 1977, Gerry, you may remember that, is purportedly being addressed by the English votes for English laws as well. Yet, at the very time when we're looking at the implications for more powers devolved to Scotland, Wales, England, you know, at the time of writing this paper, I think it still is, the welfare reform debate here was sort of in stalemate and impasse. So at the very time when England and Scotland were looking for greater powers, there was even talk here how this might bring down the Assembly, the structures here, and that some people were suggesting that it might be better if even we went back to direct rule. So there's a real sort of disconnect here between what is happening in Northern Ireland politics, perhaps some kind of, I hesitate to use the word sort of failure, but you know, people saying, well, we've only come so far, you know, perhaps better to hand this all back to Westminster and Whitehall. Yet that is completely against the sort of narrative and discourse that is coming for the rest of regions of the UK. And it's also interesting, I mean, the debate in Northern Ireland has often been, and I think rightly comes from civic groups, trade unions, civil society, and many people here may share this, and I'd like to know what people think, that the problem with politics here is, you know, are obsessed with the constitutional question, you know, national identity, and that if only we could have some sort of form, debate, as was in Scotland, about, you know, the socio-economic issues, the bread and butter politics, that somehow politics here would be informed, our life would be improved. And yet, in something like welfare, the implication of welfare reform, which has huge implications for people in society, not least the most vulnerable, affecting things like housing benefit and so forth, the parties here split on the same sort of ethno-national divide as well. Now, I'm not sure which comes first, whether it's they split because it is a socio-economic difference, they have different in terms of economic social policies, but I don't think it's a coincidence that that same divide is replicated in terms of welfare. So, question's been asked, I mean, is devolution the solution to our problems here, or is it indeed the cause of them? Contrasted, I just saw yesterday the Smith Commission, which is planning to, I think, report by the end of November now. They've taken all their submissions. There's something like 14,000 submissions from civic society in Scotland, a huge civic engagement. And one thing I would like to ask to consider, and I hope really, is whether the same kind of, you know, democratic, if you like, groundswell or engagement could take place here. And perhaps that is what is needed in some sense to revitalise politics here and to break out of the impasse. There was lots of sort of talk at the time about the turnout in Scotland. It was 85%, which was huge. People who hadn't registered before were voting. Labour voters were switching to SNP. There was a whole thing in terms of class and region and geography and so forth. But what there was in Scotland was a huge public debate, an enormous public debate. So, I mean, one question that hits me and I'd like to pose as well is, I mean, why are the people of Scotland so much more energised in politics and in their future than maybe the people here in Northern Ireland? Maybe they're not. Maybe it's because we're still tied to this binary structure of sort of an ethno-national divide. So what's happened in Scotland, again, ironically, is we're looking to perhaps saying maybe we should look back to Westminster for direct rule. There's a growing maybe anti-Westminster and anti-elite, the whole thing with expenses, scandals and so forth in Westminster is making people wary of Westminster politics, the Westminster elite, the Westminster bubble. Here, I don't think perhaps, sort of defaulting back to some kind of direct rule is the answer. I would like to think Scotland has a lesson for us, and it may be simplistic or jejune, but in terms of civic engagement, groundswell politics, because basically what happened in Scotland was a huge political event. In saying that, of course, Scotland and Northern Ireland are different. We are, as you know, from facing the news in the last month or so, in terms of also the budget crisis, there was a £100 million additional loan. The Treasury tax revenues in the UK fell for the first 6 months up to October 14. So there is basically going to be more cuts and more austerity. I don't think we're going to be able to get more £100 million sort of loans. So it's a question of, does Stormont simply have to administer austerity better? And if so, is it better having that administered from here, or do we simply default it and hand it back? The general election of 2015, I think, could well be a turning point, and it is easy to say what happened in Scotland was a turning point in UK history. I mean, if you had a pound for every newspaper headline or commentator that said that politics has changed, all has changed now utterly, whatever the result, politics and the union in the UK has changed forever. And I think that sort of discourse does have some relevance, and I think it is valid, but to a point. But also, a week is a long time in politics, the sort of the cliche. As soon as the Scottish vote happened, we have things happening like in Syria and Iraq with ISIS, with UKIP in Westminster getting their first seats. So the political situation changes, and perhaps people forget. I don't think that people in Scotland will forget the vow that was made on that morning of September the 19th. Latest, we just put there on the slides, this is one of the slides Gerry said we added very recently, looking at the latest opinion polls in Scotland, the SNP on 57%. I mean, that is huge. If in some way the vow made by the three main political parties isn't seen to being honoured or isn't being honoured quickly enough, the talk of the Scottish independence being once in a generation, I think will be revisited. The future of the Labour Party in Scotland is obviously going to be a huge issue too, because there has been a huge switch from SNP to Labour. And the politics, I think, of class have perhaps changed in Scotland, or are changing. And that is something, often the great unspoken word of we don't talk about here in Northern Ireland either. We have orange and green, and social class is very little spoken about. The huge variable in all of this, of course, is also the EU. There could have been the very strange situation if Scotland had voted for independence. Barroso and people were saying there would have been problems with them joining and so forth, but Scotland wanted to be in the EU. The Republic of Ireland is in the EU. After 2017, you could have had a situation where England and Wales were out, but the Republic of Ireland and Scotland were in, and that could have caused a huge imbalance. So I guess the kind of points I'd like to throw back at people, because the papers are in the pack here, and we didn't want to sort of sit here and just, give a lecture through those, and being the Open University, we like discussion and debate. The things I'd really like people to give us their views on and reflect on is firstly sort of the nature of politics, political engagement. Why was it so huge and important in Scotland, comparing that perhaps to Northern Ireland here, where we are in an impasse and a deadlock? It's very hard to know, if I had a crystal ball, what the future will be for the UK in relations between different parts of the UK. I think the key driver in all this really is what is going to happen in England. If the English votes for English laws takes traction, and I think certain members of the Conservative Party and UKIP will keep the pressure up. What the nature of English devolution will be, whether it's city regions, whether it's great county councils like Cornwall and Yorkshire, often looking for their, not quite sure how that will work out. So regional assemblies as Prescott's plans and New Labour in the early 2000s. We're not quite sure. Northern Ireland isn't Scotland, but I think it is safe to say that I don't think things will be the same again. And I would like to hear what you all think too. Thank you very much.